One of our goals this year is to, look forward, interpreting our history in a new way with a new perspective. Well, tonight we are doing that when we present Alexander Hamilton and the founding of the new nation, the Stowe perspective. And I'm very pleased to introduce Tom Aller and Marianne Aller. Marianne is the assistant curator of special collections at the Wellesley College Library. She is the chair of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, AHA. Do you say AHA?
The AHA Society.
AHA Society. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to the educating the public about Hamilton. They have some paperwork in the back, and if you go online and look at their website, I'd like to get their webmaster. It is spectacular, absolutely spectacular website. Dr. Tom Aller is the senior lecturer of writing program at Boston University, where he teaches a course on founding fathers Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and their competing visions of America. He's the vice chair of the AHA Society. Okay, with that, I'm going to put my papers down. And we're going to begin. Do you have your... We're going to start with the Louisa Hosmer picture. This was painted about 1830, we're assuming. We have, in the far corner, we have Captain Thorndyke's house, then the old minister's manse. The Hosmer house, right beside the Hosmer house, the little white building, is Squire Hosmer's law firm, his office. The Sopper house with the blacksmith behind. And where the Sopper house is where we would have the Stowe Shopping Center today. So if you take a look in the foreground, we have Great Road, which they would have called Lancaster Road, and Red Acre Road that goes behind. So if you take a look, that's the roads that they have, and they would take good care of them every year. This is the first map we have of Stowe that was published. It's 1794. It's not oriented correctly. I'm going to turn it. There you go. So what we have here is we have the main road, which on one end they call it the Concord Road. It goes to Lancaster. Down here we have the Sudbury Road. They had more roads than this in town, but these were the main roads that they included on this map. The other thing they included were all the different, what they called water courses, and their sawmills and their corn mills. That was what was important to them at this point. To do this program tonight, first of all, the Historical Society had to learn in depth about Alexander Hamilton, because we were on a hunt to find out information that we had in our town meeting minutes, colonial newspapers, maybe the John Gates Diary, Mass Historical Society, American Antiquarian Society, and digitized records that we could have our access to find out what we had in Stowe that would relate to Alexander Hamilton. And we were very pleased with what we found. For those of you who have never seen some of our town meeting minutes, we have many volumes that predate 1683, and they're stored very carefully in the town vault. When you look at these, they include the warrant and the minutes of every meeting. Some of the writing, like this, is very clear and easy to read. Other writing, depending on who the town clerk is, leaves us wondering. And even some of this, we'd have to guess, because you have to think phonetically, as if, well, being a teacher, it was pretty easy to do, but still, Mariana said, maybe this is the word. And you would have to put your heads together to figure out some of the words. So when you look at the information, every warrant, when you arrived, they chose a moderator every single time. The warrants always had, you talked about paying the debts, mending those highways, and maybe considering new roads. And that was a maybe, because we didn't, during this era, have much money. Constantly talked about abatements. People were trying to find ways that maybe the town would lessen their taxes. We had a problem with the care of the poor, the paupers. And then there were other warrants, but once a year, they elected all the town officials, every single year, and then they voted for their town schools. This was a literate town. Some of the papers they might have read on the far left is the Massachusetts Sentinel, the Boston Evening Post on the far right, and in the center would be Isaac Thomas's, the Massachusetts Spy, which is out of Worcester. One other really interesting source we have is John Gates' diaries. And I picked three little statements. Mainly, he talked about every sermon from every week for years and years and years. He interspersed it with weather. He interspersed it with births, baptisms, deaths, marriages, new members to the church, and political statements. So the first one right over here, it stated Thursday, April 4th, 1768. And it said it was the anniversary of the fasting day. And this is the Reverend John Gardner, this would be Henry Gardner's father, was preaching. Now at this point, Reverend Gardner had been preaching for 50 years in Stowe. And what is interesting is the royal governors for the last 90 years would call for a day of fasting just before the first planting. This was a little different because just before this April 14th, the Townshend Acts had been enacted in the colonies. And everyone here, right here, we were very, very upset with all the new taxes. And Reverend Gardner was preaching to that, and I didn't put it up here, but John Gates followed with a prayer for the American colonies. The next one is Monday, March the 5th, 1770. There was a sundry persons killed in Boston. Anyone have an idea? The Boston Massacre. There you go. Wednesday, April the 19th, 1775, was a day never known in New England before. A civil war had begun in the province. Amazing words. That's Lexington and Concord right there. We have in Stowe two key citizens that were committed to the founding of the nation. Henry Gardner, Esquire, Dr. Charles Whitman. Take a look at this. Both born in Stowe the same year. Even you're thinking, George Washington was born in 1732. So they're all contemporaries. They're all the same age. Henry Gardner's father was the minister. The Reverend Gardner bragged, sort of, you might say, about how he educated his boys. And Henry Gardner ended up at Harvard College. Dr. Charles Whitman was a deacon, John Deacon, here in Stowe. His grandfather was a reverend down in Weymouth. We have no information about where Charles Whitman at this point went to school. We will find that out. Charles Whitman's house still stands on Stowe and Crescent Street, and we're calling him Stowe's unsung hero. Everywhere we looked in the minutes, we were finding Charles Whitman over and over and over. He was a town physician. He was a selectman. He was an assessor. He represented Stowe's yearly at the Massachusetts General Court. And he was Massachusetts representative at the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention for the U.S. Constitution. We have Henry Gardner. Now, the Gardner house would be across the street from today's Common. Even though the sign, I don't know if the sign's back up yet from the construction, is on this side. The house would have been on the other side back towards the river. And he is by far our most prominent citizen of the Revolutionary period. We're going to start with this one warrant in town meeting minutes for September 26, 1774. The warrant said first to choose the moderator. Well, who did they choose? Henry Gardner, Esquire. Then they had a second issue was that his father, Henry Gardner's father had died. They're having a new minister come in, and the ordination had to be planned by the town. So who did they choose? Henry Gardner, Jonathan Wood, Deacon Samuel Gates for the committee for the ordination. Then, even though it was number 3 on their list, they had to choose the person to represent Stowe in the provincial congress in mid-October. They voted Henry Gardner, Esquire, representative of this town, to oppose the late acts of the Parliament. After Henry Gardner goes to this meeting, he's chosen the Receiver General, which is going to be the next slide, for the province. And then Dr. Charles Whitman is going to be filling all the shoes in Stowe that Henry Gardner had been doing. Who are the selectmen? Here we go again. Henry Gardner, Samuel Gates, Jonathan Wood, Charles Whitman, and Jonathan Hapgood. Henry Gardner goes to the meeting for the province in Concord. It's October 28, 1774, and he's appointed Receiver General Treasurer. That means treasurer. This announcement is in the Philadelphia newspaper. It started in Boston, and the news spread around all the colonies, and the colonies were listening very carefully to what is happening here in Massachusetts, in this Commonwealth, because we were taking the lead. The other thing that's very interesting is that they have a name up here, Harrison Gray, Esquire. And they want to make sure that nobody pays any money to the provincial government, the King's Men, or to Honorable Harrison Gray, Esquire, for very obvious reasons. And that is printed here. A couple of days later, the Massachusetts Spy in Worcester printed a story for Marblehead, letting people know in Central Mass that Marblehead is also only sending their money to Henry Gardner here in Stowe. Several days later, the same article was in Hartford, the Connecticut Current, letting everyone in the colonies know what was going on here in Massachusetts. Next thing we know, we have Lexington and Concord. Then, the Massachusetts resolves, the law in Boston had a resolve that Henry Gardner, Esquire, Receiver General of this colony, is directed to deliver to Mr. Paul Revere, engraver, the 2 pair of copper plates now in the keeping of said Receiver General, from which the last emission bills were struck, and that they would have looked like this. That means here in Stowe, Henry Gardner had the copper plates for printing the Continental money for Massachusetts. And he was taking them back to Paul Revere because Paul Revere was going to engrave new plates. Stowe was very, very active in supporting the Continental soldiers. But the Massachusetts Resolves also made a list of all of the cities and towns in Massachusetts and said, you need to bring in the hay to Cambridge. And we have here the receipt. Israel Gates brought the hay in to Cambridge, and he received the money from Henry Gardner, Esquire, the 5 pounds, as the resolve said. And this receipt was given by Franny Warren many, many years ago to the Mass Historical Society. And today, you can, if you go in, if you look at the folder number 3, number 28, you will find this receipt down in Boston. Thank you.
And now we're going to take a look at Founding Father Alexander Hamilton, whose visions and contributions to the founding of this nation are of utmost importance. Alexander Hamilton's formative years were spent in the Caribbean. You see three islands pointed to. He was born on the island of Nevis, today's St. Kitts and Nevis. And here you see Hamilton's birthplace museum there that anyone can visit. It's a wonderful place and very welcoming. Hamilton grew up in a family of a mother who was from a French Huguenot descent and a father from Scottish descent. You see his years, 1757, 1804, those are the years that are inscribed on his tomb at Trinity Church in New York. But just this year, Michael Newton, a Hamilton scholar, has consulted documents, early Danish documents, that actually prove very conclusively that Hamilton was born just a few years earlier, about 1754. Michael Newton also discovered that Hamilton and his family also spent some years on neighboring St. Eustatius, also known as Statia. And here you see Fort Oranje overlooking the harbor and the bay at Statia. The family moved eventually to St. Croix, now today's U.S. Virgin Islands. And here you see a picture of Fort Christiansvern. It's a fort from the time when Hamilton was there, a young teenager. St. Croix is the place where Hamilton started working for a trading company, for a merchant company of Beekman and Kruger, a company from New York. Later on, Hamilton referred to those years spent working at Beekman and Kruger as the most crucial part of his education, most important part. And why? It's because we see that from early on, from this experience at St. Croix, Hamilton was introduced to finance and economics and international trading, monetary issues, everything that later on he uses this core knowledge as Treasury Secretary under George Washington. So Hamilton comes to America to study in 1772. He enters King's College, in today's Columbia University, in 1773. And soon he becomes speaking out for the Patriot cause, and he starts writing pamphlets. In 1774-75, he writes very important pamphlets supporting the Patriot cause. And here,
yeah, so what you can see here is Alexander Hamilton at King's College. And what he's doing is there's a mob, a Patriot mob that is gathered to tar and feather the president of King's College because he's a loyalist. And Hamilton is a patriot, but he's also an honorable man, and he wants things done the honorable way. So he doesn't think that the president, whatever his flaws, should be subjected to that punishment. So he's standing in front of the building haranguing the crowd while President Cooper escapes out the back.
so as soon as the revolution breaks out, Hamilton enlists in a local militia company that's formed right there in today's downtown New York, the financial district. That's where King's College used to be. And soon after, he becomes an artillery captain. On March 1st, 1777, he begins his new post as aide-de-camp to General Washington. And here we say, and spy master. Yes, on occasion, he acted as such for General Washington. Here, this is a picture that illustrates artillery captain Alexander Hamilton, and he was working for the New York Artillery. He meets George Washington. General Washington is in Manhattan, and Hamilton and his company are digging in with all their guns and getting ready for encounter with the British. This picture is at the Museum of the National Heritage in Lexington. That's where we found it, and we were very excited.
All right, so the war has been going on for a year, and the Continental Congress is now about ready to formally declare independence from Great Britain. But wait, Stowe got there first. So note the date. On July 1st, 1776, at the Stowe town meeting, the citizens voted that Massachusetts Bay Colony should be independent of Great Britain and that a new government shall be formed. July 1st. So Stowe was definitely in the vanguard of independence. And note again that who's our moderator? Henry Gardner. All right. So now let's take a look at these words from the Declaration of Independence that generations of school children have memorized. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So this is what we love to believe about ourselves. These are the ideals of our country, but they don't set up a mechanism, a structure of government. So Congress had to supply that, and they came up with the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted in 1777 and didn't even come fully into effect until 1781. And this is the beginning of the Articles of Confederation. So it starts out by naming the parties who have entered the compact. So Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states of, going from north to south, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So the states are the ones who have the power. We've just thrown off one tyrant. We don't want to fall under the dominion of another. So, and only after stating the parties, the states that are supposed to have the power, do they mention the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. And immediately after making that acknowledgement, they go back to their real concern. Every state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And by the way, in Congress assembled, so that is the government of the country. There is a president, but the president is selected from among the members of the Congress. There is a court, but only ad hoc, only temporary. There's no permanent Supreme Court. And the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense and the security of their liberties. So the purpose is not that they love each other so much, not that they're trying to form a grand union, but they want to avoid being dominated by somebody else.
So, back to Stowe. They wrote it. Then they sent to each town. They had to discuss it. And so we in Stowe had to see what we were going to do upon the Articles of Confederation and perpetual unions. And we needed to send a representative with our directions to Boston to represent us. At this point, we had Jonathan Hapgood, Charles Whitman, Luke Brooks, Silas Weatherby, and Samuel Hatch, our selectman. And it was Charles Whitman who went to Boston. And these are the directions that our town meeting wrote for him to say. What they did is if we're at the town meeting, we would vote among ourselves 3 people here. Sorry, ladies, we would not have been here. So, gentlemen, we would have chosen between you. You would have had a couple days to go off, write them down. They would reconvene the town meeting. They would talk about it, and then they would give it to the person who happened to be Charles Whitman. It says we, that means the town meeting, would earnestly recommend that you, Charles Whitman, to give your strictest attention to our army, that they be provided with clothing, and that the faithful men be appointed for the business, that they may not be so shamefully neglected. Because our soldiers are without food, they're without clothing, they're in tattered shape. And that their articles be made good to them at the stated price, that is the money due to them, as the agreement was with them as they engaged in the army, as the soldiers, that they will be able and willing to defend us from our cruel enemies. And we would insist that this be seen to before any other business is done, for it is the greatest concern that our army is well provided for. Then they went on to say, we would have you, Charles Whitman, use your utmost endeavors to raise credit of our paper money that has greatly fell from the true intent of being made. One would think they had had a conversation with Alexander Hamilton with those words, because later on, Alexander Hamilton is in the national level is going to be saying the same thing.
Okay, so despite the best efforts of the Continental Congress and despite the best intentions of the citizens of Stowe and their instructions to Charles Whitman, as you know, there was a fatal flaw in the Articles of Confederation. So Congress could request from the states, but it could not compel the states to deliver funds to the Congress. So General Washington and Colonel Hamilton at his side, drafting letters for him, were constantly begging the Congress for money, for weapons, for ammunition, for supplies, and very often they were left without. So as you can see from this image, the March to Valley Forge, the army was very often very woefully supplied.
So as artillery captain, Hamilton starts following George Washington, moving north out of Manhattan, crossing the Hudson River into New Jersey, and going down towards Pennsylvania. Hamilton participates in the crossing of the Delaware River and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. By March of 1777, he's already aide-de-camp to George Washington. He's sent so early on a mission to General Gates after the Battle of Saratoga. So young Hamilton is entrusted by General Washington to go north to speak to General Gates to try to get troops back down towards New Jersey to help Washington. He also assisted Baron von Steuben, portrayed here on the right, train American troops at Valley Forge. Baron von Steuben did not speak good English at all, besides a few swear words, which his troops understood very caringly. But Hamilton spoke French, perfect French, and he was able to translate for Baron von Steuben, including create a manual for training the army. And that kind of training is very apparent later at the Battle of Monmouth, where the Americans actually held off the British very well. Hamilton is also entrusted to often negotiate prisoner exchanges. He takes part in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. He accompanies General Washington on a mission to General Rochambeau. And again, Hamilton's knowledge of French was very, very essential in communications between the Americans and the French throughout the war. And he was also on site along with General Washington when the treachery of Benedict Arnold occurred along the Hudson. Benedict Arnold had a home just across from West Point. And he just escaped minutes before General Washington and Hamilton and others arrived. Hamilton tried to chase him down to the river, but they were not able to. Benedict Arnold was able to escape on the ship Vulture. And Hamilton was also a hero of Yorktown. Now, throughout his career, being aide-de-camp to George Washington, Hamilton yearned to be in battle. He was helping Washington with writing and thinking for him. But he really wanted to be in battle, and he had that opportunity at Yorktown, where he led a battalion in a nighttime raid on Redoubt 10. At the same time, Redoubt 9 was being attacked under the command of General Lafayette. So this was a crucial victory that ultimately led to the British surrendering at Yorktown and Cornwallis surrendering. George Washington, many, many years later, in a letter to John Adams, just a year before he passed away, he writes to John Adams that Colonel Hamilton was the principal and most confidential aide of the commander-in-chief. And that's how Washington felt and referred to Hamilton throughout his life. Now, during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton never stopped learning. He carried big books along with him at night when everybody else was sleeping. He would be reading about economics, about finance. He was thinking, what would happen when this war is over? How are we going to sustain the peace? How are we going to sustain our freedoms? And he was studying European economists. He was trying to pick the best out of the systems that existed and to imagine the future of this country. Here you see a quote from a letter by Hamilton to Robert Morris. And Robert Morris was the financier of the revolution. He was in Philadelphia supporting the revolution with his personal funds. So Hamilton writes to Robert Morris, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement for our union. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. We'll refer to this quote a little bit later.
So back in Stowe, we have Continental Currency, 1775. From until 1778, the currency had lost its value to 1/5 to 1/7 of its face. By 1780, the Continentals were worth about 1/40. Now, those are just numbers. When we took a look at our town meeting minutes, when they were talking about what they were paying each year for our debts, 1775, 80 pounds. 1776, 80 pounds. 1777, 80 pounds. 1778, it shot up to 200. Take a look at the depreciation. Then it went to 1,200, and then it went up to 4,000. That is what is happening to the value of our money. Everybody was stretched to their limit. They were bartering back and forth. They're trying just to survive. The other thing with the survival was that they had what they call the necessaries of life. And they were so concerned about it in Massachusetts Bay that they had a bill passed that the towns were responsible. They had to act and take care of those people who needed the help. And Stowe, on August 2nd, 1779, passed that they would support it. And we find in the town meeting minutes that they are taking widows and children, they're taking other people who need help into their homes. We have a reference from John Gates that he had taken people into his home, and they are hoping in the future possibly they'll get the town will help pay them back, but they're going to take care of their own. There's another table from 1780 to show you what is happening here in Stowe. We have to remember that at this time the hard currency was the Spanish milled dollar. But we in Massachusetts also had a paper currency that if we had 40 Massachusetts dollars, it would be one Spanish milled dollar. But by 7 months later, it was up to 74. It almost doubled. We are in inflation and in debt horribly. So what are we doing? What have we been doing forever here in Stowe is this has been a town that bartered. It's totally fascinating. We are very fortunate that we have the John Gates Ledger. And in it, he has page after page from members of everyone in town of who owes him. We picked two examples. Here's Dr. Charles Whitman. He is the debtor to John Gates Jr. He has gotten cider from him, half day's work, more cider, more work, a bushel of oats cider, a bushel of flaxseed, a pound of goose feathers. And this went on for 6 years until they, what they called, reckoned, and they were even. And when you know that it's been solved, they put the X across it. John Gates Jr. Passed away. They do not waste any paper. So his son kept the journal going. And now John Gates III is the debtor to Ichabod Stowe. Now, Ichabod Stowe would lived on the other side in Harvard Road. And Ichabod Stowe supplied John Gates III with 4 pains, something for his headache. We have one day work to work, and we aren't sure what this is. If anyone has any ideas, it's to work about it looks like morking. We have tried all sorts of, if anyone has any farming background, more than likely has something to do with farming. We haven't been able to decipher that. He was making a pair of wheels, mended ropes, did something with the stock, wagon wheels, barrel of cider, mended a sleigh, and built a coffin. And then we don't know when this was reckoned, but they paid it off. They were equal. To understand what we were doing in Stowe, even in 1790, we are still using the pound, the shilling, the pence, and the farthing. And our taxes are here. To vote, you had to have a certain amount of property, and then you paid a poll tax to vote. You had your real estate tax, you had property tax. If you are a widow, your name would also be here, except you would not have any poll tax because we have to wait to 1920, ladies, a long time before we are voting. The abatements, constant abatements, trying to get relief from their taxes. And this is 1778. The first one, we have Joshua Green, who's trying to get an abatement from his taxes from 1770, 8 years ago. He's still trying to pay it off. And then we have Phineas Taylor Jr., who has trying to get an abatement. Sometimes the town meeting gives them relief. Other times they say, figure out how you're going to pay it. The other thing, way they raised money in Stowe is they had their highway rates for the road, the amount of road that ran along your property. And continuously, Dr. Charles Whitman and Thomas Whitman, the 4 men, were asking to, instead of paying it, that they would repair the roads themselves in front of their land. It was very interesting, and they were always given permission to do that. But in Charles Whitman's case, that in his house, he had his adult son, who was Charles Whitman Jr., and he had, and his wife, And he had 3 daughters who were married with husbands, all in the same house. So I'm sure Dr. Charles Whitman would be asking some of the younger generation to get out there and do the roads, because he is doing so much for the town and the state government besides being the town physician. In our warrants, this is very interesting. They wanted to know, this is 1781, if they would allow the constable to take $75 of the old admission, the old money, to pay 1 of silver for the soldiers for 3 years. Now, this is a town that supported their soldiers. However, it's passed in the negative. That means they didn't pass it. They called it pass in the negative. And they went back and they had to rethink this. So 3 months later, what they did, they discussed it, they changed their wording, and they bundled it together with the town debts, and they voted and granted a sum of 250 pounds silver money to pay the town debts and to hire men into the Continental service, because they were going to pay their soldiers from Stowe. There is no way they weren't going to do it, but they just didn't want any writing of the old paper money in it at all. To show you the problem we have in Stowe with depreciation, we have a new minister in town, the Reverend Mr. Jonathan Newell. And the town is supposed to be paying him a salary. Well, they're paying it, but the salary is looking worth so little, Reverend Newell is having a hard time living. And he keeps going back to the town through a warrant and saying, can you please give me some more money? One time they gave him a piece of clothing. Another time they gave him a bag of grain. And finally, after 6 years of this, they chose a committee of 3 men, and they figured out what they were going to do to help their minister receive enough money so he could support his family and his children. And that took 6 years to get that straight. We have, every year, we have a new treasurer, and it's person elected, and then the committee is appointed to check every single item that he has on his list to make sure it is accurate. And they do this every single year. Well, we have a problem in 1784. They ended up with old money, 26 pounds of worthless money that they had to figure out or just absorb. They were not happy. The other thing they have is that they actually were changing some of the roads. And in front of William Maxwell's house, the road had taken a new turn, and William Maxwell could actually buy that land, the old road, and extend his property. But the only way the town would allow him to do it is that he had to pay in the 3 milled Spanish dollars. It had to be the hard currency, none of the paper money. We have a problem with Confederate notes in Stowe. And what are we going to do? Back to the Commonwealth. While this is going on, our Commonwealth is writing our Constitution. This Constitution was read article by article, section by section, chapter by chapter in front of the town meeting. It's hard to imagine. They went through everything. Democracy at work, it's absolutely amazing, because this is the oldest working constitution in the world. And Constitution is the foundation, the guidance that they used for the U.S. Constitution right here. And you can see what we did here in Stowe. Whenever there was something that they weren't quite sure on, and they was in the negative, they wrote down why they thought differently. So we have their whole thought right there. Just real quick to see how they voted. Now, they voted for their government, the Commonwealth governor, every single year. John Hancock, for the first 5 years, his health was poor. He did not run. It was James Bowdoin. Then John Hancock said, okay, I'll come back. He came back, and then he died in office, and then it was Samuel Adams. We have a problem still in Stowe and in Massachusetts, in Middlesex County. Because we are under Articles of Confederation, We are just trying to figure it out just for Massachusetts, and we have high grievances for the inflation, and we have foreclosures. John Nutting of Groton called a meeting for people in Middlesex County to go to Concord to discuss these grievances. And we sent Dr. Charles Whitman and Lieutenant Moses Richardson. What is very interesting is this made the news for this meeting in Philadelphia. So people are watching around our Confederate states what is going on here in Massachusetts. So what is happening? The farmers who fought in the Revolutionary War received little payment. Businesses were demanding pay for goods which had been bought on credit and often paid off by bartering. Businesses did not want to barter. They wanted the hard currency, and we didn't have it. The Massachusetts residents' taxes were higher than ever. Authorities began arresting the farmers, and foreclosures followed. And this was the prelude for Shays' Rebellion in Western Mass, and they were concerned it was going to happen here. So they sent Charles Whitman to Congress with some directions. What can we do? Now here again, these are the words of the town meeting to Charles Whitman. And these words echo everything that Alexander Hamilton was going to be saying a few years from now on the national level. So we said it here first. I mean, so we, the town meeting, confide in your wisdom and integrity. And that's what they think of Charles Whitman. Use your influence to lighten the taxes upon the land and provide means to raise money by duties and excise upon all kinds of imported articles, principally upon wines and distilled liquors, foreign and domestic, and the luxury of dresses. Because, ladies, we've been making all of our clothes, and now they're importing them from Europe. And they are actually, and people aren't too happy about this because they're coming in cheaper. And that proceeds and profits of said duties be appropriated solely to the payment of our foreign debts. That's Alexander Hamilton right there. We have to pay our debts. Endeavor to lower the salaries of the civil list, protect the interest of widows and orphans, and we expect you to use your utmost influence that the distilled liquors pay the duty at the distillery.
Wrong way.
Okay, so as Marilyn mentioned, Shays' Rebellion breaks out. So in and around Springfield and Western Massachusetts. So what happens is the farmers, the veterans can't take it anymore. They've been suffering too much. Their citizens are being arrested. They're being thrown in debtor's prison. Farms are being foreclosed upon. And they rise up. They close the courts. They take judges prisoner. And this revolt shakes the young country to the core. It's really shocking, and because of the newspapers, the news spreads throughout all of the states. So at the time when the rebellion is breaking out, Hamilton and James Madison of Virginia and others have worked to convene a convention in Annapolis for the purpose of trying to deal with some of the rivalries and enmities between the different states. And the convention in one way is a failure because only 5 states bother to show up and send delegates. But in another way is a success because it led to the calling of a convention the following year in Pennsylvania, which became the Constitutional Convention. And the initial purpose of the convention was, again, to revise the Articles of Confederation. But very soon, some of the leaders made clear that it was going to be an attempt to scrap the Articles and replace them with a totally new form of government. And that's our U.S. Constitution. And if you look at the words of the preamble of the Constitution, they're very carefully chosen, and they're a direct rebuke, a direct rejection of the Articles. So we, the people of the United States, so power is vested in the people of a single country rather than vested in the states themselves, in order to form a more perfect union, because the old union was dysfunctional, it was falling apart. Establish justice, because there were no permanent courts. Ensure domestic tranquility, because many states were at each other's throats, having trade wars and almost on the verge of declaring war against each other. And provide for the common defense, because we still had concern that England or some other foreign power might invade. And promote the general welfare, again, because so many people were suffering as a result of the weakness of the old government. And secure the blessings of liberty, not only to ourselves, but to our posterity, because some feared that the new republic would not stand because it was so fragile. So for all of these reasons, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So some of the major figures on the national stage who were Federalists, that is, they supported the Constitution, General George Washington, so he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He spoke very little. He kept a diary, but in his diary he was so scrupulous, so careful, that he said almost nothing about the proceedings because they were meant to be kept secret. But his solemnity, his dignity, made sure that the proceedings were conducted in a very proper and decorous way. Alexander Hamilton of New York, he was one of 3 delegates. The other 2 delegates from New York were anti-Federalists. They were against the Constitution. They left early, and Hamilton remained a passionate defender of the Constitution. And even though New York lacked a quorum, he put his signature on the Constitution. And the father of the Constitution, James Madison of Virginia, he's the one that presented the Virginia Plan, or rather wrote the Virginia Plan. And that became, with some modifications, the framework of the Constitution. So in Massachusetts, we had 4 delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia: Rufus King, Nathaniel Gorham, and Caleb Strong, all supported the Constitution. King and Gorham signed, and Caleb Strong intended to sign, but he was called home due to illness in the family. And Elbridge Gerry, whose name you know because of the gerrymander, was initially in favor of the Constitution, but then he turned against it and refused to sign. So 2 out of our 4 delegates ended up signing the Constitution, King and Gorham. And who were some of the other leading Massachusetts Federalists? We have John Adams, who at this time is minister to the Court of St. James in England, but he was a major advocate of the Constitution. Paul Revere, a businessman and artisan, definitely wanted a stable government and a stable economy. Now, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were initially against the Constitution, but they were listening to the debates at the ratifying convention, and they came up with a compromise. And the compromise was, anti-federalists, if you agree to ratify the Constitution, then we Federalists will promise very quickly to move to add a Bill of Rights, because the absence of a Bill of Rights was one of the major objections in the Commonwealth and across the country to the Constitution. So both sides took a leap of faith. Both sides trusted each other. And as a result of the Massachusetts Compromise crafted by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the Constitution was ratified in Massachusetts. And we have... Should I do this one, or you?
We can do it together. Okay. All right, it's Stowe. All right, so it came to Stowe. It came to every town in Massachusetts, every town in the United States. And our town meeting, heard the United States Constitution read and proceeded to choose Dr. Charles Whitman, no surprise, a delegate to represent the town of Stowe and the District of Boxborough at the convention in Boston on the second Wednesday of January, 1788. Again, they appointed a committee of 3 men to write the directions for him, his instructions. They reconvened, they brought it together, they gave him his directions. They left a space in the town meeting minutes to write down those directions, and they forgot to add them. So, but we do know that he carried his directions to Boston, and we do know that he voted for the Constitution. Stowe told him to vote for the United States Constitution.
Right. So we don't have any record of any speech being given by Dr. Whitman at the ratifying convention, but as Marilyn said, he voted for, and it was a lucky thing he did because the vote was very close, so 187 to 186. That's pretty surprising because Massachusetts and New England generally are known to be Federalist territory, but again, there was this deep concern against too strong a central government, deep concern about having a Bill of Rights, which hadn't yet been written. So, yeah. 187, pardon me, made a mistake. 187 to 168, excuse me. So in this cartoon from the period, we see, and these pillars are representing states that are supporting the Constitution. So it turns out that the states of Delaware and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Georgia and Connecticut all very quickly ratified the Constitution. Massachusetts was a major hurdle because of this very closely contested debate. But thanks to the Massachusetts Compromise, the largest state and the most important state in New England ratified, and then the Constitution was off to a good start. Now, the job wasn't done, so two of the biggest states in the Union, Virginia and New York, still remained. So in Virginia, you have Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, one of the leaders of the opposition at the ratifying convention. James Monroe, a soldier who crossed the Delaware with Washington against the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was at this time the minister to France, but his friend James Madison was keeping him apprised of the proceedings, and he was against the Constitution as well. George Clinton, the perennial governor of New York, a very powerful voice against the Constitution. So in response to Clinton in New York, Alexander Hamilton, along with James Madison and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote 51 out of the 85, and with his skilled arguments in writing and his oratory at the ratifying convention, turned things around. So Virginia ratified, New York very quickly thereafter. So with Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York ratifying, the Constitution was set to go. Soon thereafter, Washington was inaugurated president, and soon after that, we have a cabinet. So from left to right, we have George Washington, we have Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Alexander Hamilton standing, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. And just for the record, Alexander Hamilton was nominated Treasury Secretary on September 11, 1789. He was confirmed on September 11, 1789, and he sat down to work on September 11, 1789, and started writing reports to try to stabilize the economy.
So let's just take a look at what the newly elected President Washington encountered. We already saw what the situation was in Stowe during the Revolution and after. Well, it was the same in terms of the federal government and the whole of the country. The US government finances were in shambles. The country was totally bankrupt, no revenue to pay the debt. There was no banking system. There were only three local banks in existence. No central bank, no securities markets. The money being used were just various foreign and state currencies. And there were very few corporations being created. only less than 3 per chartered per year in each state. At the end of Alexander Hamilton's term as Treasury Secretary, the US government finances, this is just, bear in mind, it's only like 6 years later. The US government finances were a great credit. Enough money to pay interest on the debt. The banking system has increased to 23 state-chartered banks. There was a central bank, the Bank of the US in Philadelphia, with 4 branches already established. There were securities markets with regular price quotations printed in newspapers. The money was the convertible US dollar backed by gold and silver, and corporations were on the rise. There were nearly 40 corporations already established in the US. Well, how did all that happen? Well, it was Alexander Hamilton's financial and economic plan for this country. Hamilton's vision for America. How did he present it? His plan was basically laid out in a form of reports to Congress. These reports, report on public credit, report on the bank, report on the mint, and report on manufacturers, were submitted in the first 2 years of Hamilton being the first US Treasury Secretary. Report on public credit. So what Hamilton was trying to do is to make the country credit worthy, to establish credit. No one would lend to this country, no one would want to lend to the government if the country is not credit worthy. So what does that mean? We have to pay all our debts. So what Hamilton's plan was is he thought of the best way to do is to assume, to take over all the state debts by the national government and all the foreign debts, everything to be assumed under the national government. In this way, all the states will start on equal basis, being free of debt and growing from there on. As part of the report on public credit, also there is the clause of non-discrimination among holders of the debt. So, of course, Hamilton and everyone wanted to pay the vouchers that those soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War needed still to be paid. But some of those soldiers had sold their vouchers to others. Well, nothing we can do about it. Hamilton was being attacked that his plan is not taking in consideration those soldiers. But what was more important is to preserve the contract as a concept that the whole society was laying on. If you have sold something, that should be a deal. The other person should be the new owner. You cannot go back and say, no, that was mine. And that was very, very important. And although it was painful, knowing that some soldiers will not get their share and their fair pay, Hamilton had to uphold those norms and pillars of society. So, of course, there was a lot of outcry because some of the states, like Virginia, for example, they had already paid their debts. But other states like Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, the states where the war was going on, most of the fighting was going on, those states were deep in debt. So the assumption actually of the debts helped out to the whole country. Here we go to, again, I mentioned before that Hamilton during the Revolutionary War was already thinking finance and how are we going to save this country. This is a statement where he goes back to his thought of the debt being a national blessing. But take a look down on the bottom. He says it would be a national blessing if it would be accompanied by the means of its extinguishment. This he, meaning the Treasury Secretary, Hamilton, regards as the true secret for rendering public credit immortal.
So there was major opposition to the report on credit in Congress, and that opposition was led by James Madison, who you see on the right, who is the head of the what are soon to be called the Democratic Republicans in Congress. And it was also, the opposition was led from within Washington's own cabinet by Thomas Jefferson, who you see in the middle, Secretary of State. So we have two members of the president's cabinet on opposite sides of this argument. And we have on the right, James Madison, an author, a major author of the Federalist Papers, the father of the Constitution, against this bill. But what's interesting is there are two bills that are under consideration at the same time. We have this bill on public credit based on Hamilton's first report, and then we have the residency bill. Where should the capital of the United States be? So when Washington is inaugurated for his first term, he's inaugurated in New York City at Federal Hall. And but we know that that's not necessarily going to be the permanent capital. There's about a dozen cities that nominate themselves to be capital. And of course, the Virginians, Washington and Jefferson and Madison and others, want the capital to be down in Virginia. Hamilton, whose adopted state is New York, would love to have it be in New York City, but at Jefferson's residence on Maiden Lane in New York, these three men come together and they hammer out a compromise. So Hamilton agrees not to oppose moving the capital first to Philadelphia and then finally to the Potomac in Virginia, which becomes Washington, D.C., and Jefferson and Madison agree not to oppose the bill on public credit. So both bills pass in this historic compromise.
So the second major paper that Hamilton submits, a report that Hamilton submits to Congress, is the report on creating a bank, the Bank of the U.S. That also encounters great opposition from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and their supporters in Congress. This is, by the way, an engraving of the first Bank of the U.S. It's still standing in Philadelphia, and it's the very first building that was commissioned by the new federal government. It's currently closed, but we're hoping soon it will be reopened as part of Independence Park. So it's an exciting development going on.
So Hamilton needed some kind of justification for creating a bank. And if you go to the Constitution, you look at Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress. So Congress, among other things, shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, to borrow money on the credit of the U.S., to regulate commerce, to coin money, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So that last clause, necessary and proper, the elastic clause. So if it makes sense to do all of these things that are allowed under the Constitution, it also makes sense to have a bank which will facilitate all of these activities. And Hamilton looks expansively at the Constitution. A bank would be necessary and proper in order to borrow money on the credit of the U.S., etc. So appeal directly to the Constitution. And then the opposition, Madison and Jefferson and others, appeal to the Constitution again, the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So how do you decide? Here's a constitutional conflict, one part of the Constitution against the other. So what Washington does is he asks his cabinet officers to write responses to his questions on the constitutionality of the bank. And Jefferson's response is kind of arcane, kind of brief. Hamilton goes all out, but he lays it out in exquisite detail, very long response. Here's a draft of his letter to Washington. Washington reads all the responses. He's convinced by Hamilton and signs the bill into law, and we get a Bank of the U.S., which, by the way, is 20% owned by the government, 80% in private hands. And even though Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury, he has zero control over the bank. So he deliberately organized it so there would be not even any appearance of a conflict of interest.
And the third report, the report on the mint, led to the establishment of the mint in Philadelphia, here shown, for coining money. And Hamilton created a single uniform stable currency that provided a fixed unit of value, and that is our US dollar, backed by gold and silver. Now the main... Lady Liberty. Yes. The main income of the new government was coming through tariffs at the time. And Hamilton created the Revenue Marine, or Revenue Cutter Service, now known as the U.S. Coast Guard. And the role of the Revenue Marine was, of course, to guard the shores against pirates and smugglers, and to assure that tariffs are properly and paid in timely fashion.
What is interesting is that for the first time in our town meeting minutes, it was 1797, April the 3rd, is when we finally converted to U.S. money. They didn't use any of the pounds, so we were finally in Stowe up to snuff and using our new currency for the United States. Whoops, wrong way, sorry.
And the last report, but very important report that Hamilton submitted to Congress, is the Report on Manufactures. That's how it's called. It provided a plan to promote growth and self-sufficiency of the young country. Now what you see here is a picture of Patterson Great Falls in New Jersey. And that's an important place because Hamilton started thinking about manufacturing and the importance of manufacturing a long time ago. Back during the Revolutionary War, after the Battle of Monmouth, General Washington, Lafayette, and Hamilton have a lunch meeting right here. They would sit on the banks and look over the falls. And while they're having their nice lunch and relaxing, Hamilton is thinking, how can we capture the power of the falls? So later on, Hamilton helped establish the Society of Useful Manufacturing, or SUM, at the Great Falls of the Passaic River in New Jersey. And there is a national park there today that marks that. So why manufacturing? And why Hamilton is focusing on that? Because he's thinking, now we have gained our political independence from Great Britain, but until we are economically independent, we will never be independent. So that's why this report on manufacturing becomes part of his total overall economic and financial plan for the country. Of course, that report also encountered resistance because someone like Thomas Jefferson, for example, he viewed the future of the country as being agrarian. He wanted to continue the lifestyle the way that it has been experienced until then. But Hamilton had a vision for the future.
And here in Stowe, we are the agricultural community. However, down in which we now call Gleasondale, Abraham Randall bought the land where there was a small grist mill and a sawmill. And he bought it in 1815 because now everything what Hamilton had done with the manufacturing, with the credit, that he could do this. He established an industry to help the independents right here. And this is the factory. It was a cotton and woolen mill. And it went, then after many years, it was the Randall Mill, then it was the Rock Bottom Company with Felton and Hale. It turned to Gleason and Dale, turned to Gleason Dale. And it's something Stowe needs to be very proud of because it leads right from what Hamilton was pushing, and we have evidence of it right here in Stowe.
So in January of 1795, Hamilton steps down as Treasury Secretary. He has already accomplished his plan for the economic and financial growth of this country. He steps down assured that the credit is strong. Other countries and people within the country would be lending to this country from now on, and there will never be danger of this country falling in the condition that it was during the Revolutionary War and the period up to the first Washington government. So we hope that you have been sufficiently inspired by us finding so many documents to show you what's going on here in Stowe and how much it reflects what was going on a national scene. Thank you.
We also wanted to just tell you a little bit about, if you're interested, matter of fact, it'd be easier for you to do it for me. You can find on Founders Online, wonderful, wonderful website by the government.
Yeah, Founders Online is organized by the National Archives, and you can find the papers of an awful lot of the major founding fathers. Certainly Alexander Hamilton is there, and you can see not only letters written by Hamilton, but everything, all the correspondence that came to him as well, and all the other founders. So that's a great place to go to search as well. You can do keyword searching. You can find the topics that you are interested in right away. In terms of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, I just wanted to tell you very proudly that the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society was established as a 501c3 right here in Stowe.
I didn't mention, but the Allers do live in Stowe. We're
Yes,
all
we do.
Stowites here, okay?
Yeah, so this is our society here in Stowe. And if you are interested, if you'd like to look us up on our website, you could also sign up for letters from Publius, which is our newsletter, a monthly newsletter that kind of tells you what the society is doing. And you could also visit Hamilton Grange National Memorial in New York City. That's the only house that Hamilton ever really had. He lived very short time there, just a couple of years before he was killed. He was mortally wounded in the duel with Aaron Burr. But I am proud to say that the AHA Society has become partner of Hamilton Grange National Memorial. We are their partner, and we work together with the National Park Service for that site. You could also visit the sites of Hamilton's early years in the Caribbean. Nevis, now we added Statia, thanks to Michael Newton's discoveries, and St. Croix, and many other sites. Of course, many of the battlefields. He was just all the time next to General Washington throughout the war. So wherever Washington went, Hamilton was there. Thank you.